So the Kraken have made their final cuts, and just like that, the third Seattle Kraken season, the 23-24 season, is upon us. So before the puck drops on Tuesday in Vegas to get a start on the season, we should probably talk about some expectations for this upcoming season, as well as going over what we saw in the preseason. However much of it you're actually able to watch, as the team definitely seemed to take the complaints some have had about how easy it is to watch regular season games and said, hold my beer. Regardless of that, though, we will be back to regular programming, at least for now. Hopefully there will be some more regular streaming options like we've seen Vegas take up and a couple of other teams here coming in the future for the Kraken. But aside from the availability of watching games, what actually happens in them is what we're here to talk about today. And of course, it all starts with who made the team in the first place. Now, most of the spots on this roster we were expecting to stay the same, and they did, but there were a couple of spots up for grabs, like Donato and Sprong's spot, or Geeky's spot for that matter, on that fourth line. Two spots that were kind of rotated in and out, even with Burakovsky out of the lineup, that were now opened up with those guys leaving, as well as one spot on the defensive end with Soucy's exit. And of course, also the situation in goal where there's Grubauer, and then trying to keep Decord and not lose him to waivers, while still having another NHL goaltender on the roster. Now on the defensive end, it was pretty straightforward, with Dumoulin being signed in the offseason, Megna still on the roster, and Riker Evans being sent down to the AHL as a part of this final cut. Dumoulin will clearly take that spot that Soucy had alongside Schultz on either the second or third pair, depending on where they feel like having Alexiak and Borgen play. With, of course, the first pair still being Dunn and Larson as long as both of them are healthy, which is kind of a question mark right now, as Dunn did miss the end of the preseason, but that seems like it was more of a cautionary move by the Kraken, and it sounds like he should be ready by, well, they said early next week, but that pretty much puts it in line for Tuesday's game to start the season. Of course, I say it was a pretty straightforward decision, but in the end, Riker Evans did try to make it a very hard decision for the Kraken to make. Ultimately, though, while he did actually play well enough in this preseason that I would say he's one of the 6 best defensemen the Kraken have, it's borderline, probably in that 5th or 6th spot, so he'd be a third pairing defenseman, and he is the one guy out of that group that the Kraken could send straight to the AHL and not send through waivers. That, along with the fact that I think they'd like to get him a little bit bigger of a role than a third pair when he comes right in, it was a somewhat predetermined decision that he would be going to the AHL rather than starting in the NHL at the start of the season. That having been said, though, as soon as somebody goes down to injury for any kind of extended period of time, which obviously we hope takes quite a while if it happens at all, we'd ideally like it to not happen, but ultimately this is the NHL, it's an 82-game season, and injuries are bound to happen at some point. And when that happens in the defensive end, I would be pretty surprised if Evans wasn't the first call up, especially considering in the preseason, they even gave him a couple of games on his offside just to test the water there and see if he could hold up on either side of the defense. And when that call is made, he'll probably jump right into the lineup, skipping over that 7th spot that the Kraken carry, which in this case will likely be Megna for most of this season. Really, the only reason that Evans isn't already in that spot is that, well, it's better for Evans and the Kraken future if they send him down to the AHL where he can play games and develop, rather than riding the bench like we saw with Cale Fleury last year. Especially considering that may not have really helped out Cale Fleury all that much, as he really did not have a particularly great preseason and also will be going to the AHL. And either way, regardless of what happens this season, if we really wanted to get ahead of ourselves and look all the way to a year from now and the start of next season, with both Schultz and Megna set to be free agents at the end of this season, that will leave a starting spot in the Kraken defense for Evans to step into next year, and it will likely be his to lose, unless he just has a total regression in the AHL, which, considering the progress he's made over the last couple of years, would be a shock. And then in goal for the Kraken, honestly, I think this was a pretty straightforward decision for the team to end up making as well, given that Decord held up his end and played as well in this preseason in camp as we've seen him do in the last couple of years in the AHL, and even some of his starts in the NHL in that time as well, which he was definitely able to do. Ultimately, it came down to the fact that Drieger is going to cost an extra $1 million for someone to take off of waivers than Decord has, and really hasn't played that much over the last couple of seasons, or especially last season where he spent pretty much the entire time recovering from his injury the previous summer. And it really has not been the smoothest road to recovery for Drieger, who wasn't necessarily fantastic in his time in the AHL, before the end of last season and also did not have a great camp. So it was always going to be easier for the Kraken, even if the two of them played relatively similar in this preseason, for them to get Drieger through waivers and to the AHL than for them to get Decord through waivers, costing about $1 million less, and also being younger. Again, especially with this being the last of the flat cap era years due to COVID, with next year the cap supposed to jump $5 to $6 million, it could definitely make it more challenging for teams to sneak guys through waivers. Not that I'm terribly convinced that Drieger would have been claimed anyway in this particular case, because again, wasn't the best preseason, and he still seems to be figuring out how to get back from that injury over a year ago. So that then brings us to the forward end, where things were a little bit more interesting with 2 open spots and a number of guys that could end up filling them. Of course, the top 9 or really even 10 forwards won't come as a surprise to anybody, including the top 3 lines that are going to look a lot like what we would have expected had everyone been healthy last season. We'll have Beniers on that first line, centering Eberle and McCann. The second line will be Wemberg center with Burakovsky and Schwartz on either side. The third line, of course, Gord with Bjorkstrand and Tolvanen, and Tanev definitely getting one of the spots on the fourth line. So then the question was, who would get those second 2 spots? Or I should say the last 2 spots on that fourth line. Now at center, there was pretty much only 2 options. It's Pierre-Edouard Bellemare or Shane Wright. But honestly, fourth line center is really, I don't think, where the Kraken want Wright to be stepping into, especially considering that they had the AHL as an option this year, getting that deal done with the OHL, that Wright wouldn't have to go back there. So with it unlikely that he would fill out the fourth line, he was going to have to really have a fantastic, almost incredible preseason to kick Wemberg out of what's probably eventually going to be his spot, likely next season on that second line. Assuming everything goes well, obviously at the AHL level this year, he still has some progress to make, but he made a lot of progress this summer and came back looking a lot better than he did in his time, at least in the NHL last year during this preseason. So Bellemare probably taking that spot then at center. You have 1 spot left on the wing, where of course Kyler Yamamoto or potentially Ty Cartier would fill it. Even potentially Cole Lind would be a sleeper spot for that as well. And once again, like I've said really since the end of last season, whenever this has come up, this was not necessarily Cartier's spot to lose, even with how well he played in the postseason. Ultimately, that was only 10 games that he played, and yes, they're the 10 most meaningful games the Kraken have had in the franchise's young history, and he played well in them, but it's still not a lot to go off of, so he was going to have to prove himself if he wanted to stay in this starting lineup or on the roster at all. So, well, it probably was inevitable that he would have played at some point this season with injuries and all that. It was going to be a spot that he had to earn in this preseason if he wanted to make the roster or starting lineup for that matter. And he definitely did in this preseason. As really the 3 or 4 guys that I was most interested to watch this preseason all played pretty well. That, of course, being Evans, Wright, Cartier, and even Kyler Yamamoto, I thought played pretty well in the spots he was in. And honestly, if I had to pick one of the 3 of them that are forwards as to who had the best preseason, I would say Cartier without too much of a second thought, even with all 3 of them having played pretty well. I'd probably say of the 4, I would still pick Evans as having the most impressive preseason, especially considering he didn't have quite as clear cut of a way to get into the lineup, and really, I think, made it a tough decision for the team to make to end up sending him back to the AHL, at least to start things out, but we've already talked about that. Cartier, though, definitely earned his spot in this starting lineup, and while I do think that Yamamoto will be getting his chances, especially considering he might offer a little bit more on the power play for the Kraken, and that could still be something that's a work in progress if the preseason is any indication as this season gets started. Cartier, with the preseason he had, definitely seems to be continuing to prove that that playoffs he had with the Kraken just a few months ago was not a fluke, and the team very well may have found a diamond in the rough here with this undrafted player. Again, like I just pretty much said, but in different words, both of them will be a part of the starting roster, though I think Cartier is more likely to be a part of the starting opening day lineup, while Yamamoto will probably be one of the extras that the Kraken carry on the forward end. Currently, as far as the roster is constructed, they only have the 2 spare players where they can carry 3, with Yamamoto being the lone extra forward, and Megna the lone extra 7th defenseman. And of course, with Shane Wright being sent back to the AHL along with Riker Evans, where honestly I do feel like Wright played well enough that he looks NHL ready, just for more of a bottom six type of role at this point. And while he could fill that third spare spot that the Kraken have on their roster and be the second forward, they don't want him riding the bench and just practicing like he had to at the start of last season because of the whole OHL situation. Now that they can send him to the AHL, it's much better for his development that he goes there and plays games, even if he probably will be getting some NHL time later this season, again, depending on injuries and how his AHL season goes at the start. Plus, if again we wanted to look way too far off into the future and the start of next season, assuming everything goes perfectly this year for Wright and he continues to develop and really look good at the AHL level, and even in some of the games that I would be pretty surprised if he doesn't end up playing some games at the NHL level this year, then Wennberg is in his contract year and will be a free agent at the end of this season if he doesn't get an extension. So if Wright looks ready, that second line center role could very much be his to earn as early as next season, and maybe even be his to lose depending on how well he does this season and next preseason. While we're on that subject, it would be a very good thing for the Kraken if it were to play out that way, because as much as Wennberg has offered a lot of good things to this team, especially defensively, and maybe being the best skater the team has and best in transition, he also is commanding $4.5 million that the Kraken, even with the extra cap that they'll be getting with the cap going up next season, will likely need to take advantage of when Matty Beniers' contract comes to getting re-signed. That is, although next summer's problem, or I guess next spring, depending on when contracts need to get signed there. So as far as the team is concerned right now and going into the season and expectations for the season, well, like I said in my Pacific Division preview and prediction video, I would expect a pretty similar season from the Kraken, at least as far as what their performance looks like. Somewhere around 100 points. I wouldn't be shocked if they fall more into the mid to high 90s as far as that's concerned, drop back to maybe say 95, 96 points. Still very much in the conversation for one of those wildcard spots in the Western Conference. And if a team like the Kings, for example, has a disappointing season, I'm not really expecting a disappointing season from either the Oilers or Golden Knights, but if the Kings were to fall back and the Flames continue to be, well, a bit of a mess like they were last year, the Kraken still definitely have the opportunity to jump into that third spot in the division. Also, it's hockey and anything can happen, as we saw last year. No one expected that team to finish fourth in the division, but as it is, this team, I would say, right around 95 to 100 points again, which I feel like is a pretty reasonable expectation and certainly not a hot take by any means, especially considering, like we've just gone over, this team is basically the same as what we saw last year as long as everyone stays healthy, with just a couple of differences on the fourth line, third pair defense, and backup goaltender, none of which are make or break roles, even on a team that gets to where it was via depth like the Kraken. Now, yes, it's fair to point out that the Kraken may not have gotten to where they were last season if it wasn't for that hot streak that Martin Jones had at the very start of last season after Grubauer had that early injury, or they may not have been the same team as they were without the 21 goals from Sprong or 14 goals from Donato, but I think they can find that production elsewhere. Again, Matty Beniers is likely to take a step forward, especially if this preseason is any indication, as he looked like a man on the mission, and yes, it's preseason, we shouldn't read into it too much, but Beniers frequently looked like the best player on the ice, unless McDavid was out there at the same time. But Beniers looks like a player that's ready to take that next step. You've got a full season of Cartier, who, yeah, even if he's on a fourth line, that's where Sprong got a lot of his production from, as well as power play, which Cartier could fill that role, or Yamamoto for that matter when he steps in there. And you also have now a full season of Eli Tolvanen, who, aside from Beniers, may have been the second best forward the Kraken had this preseason and could be very well primed for a 30-plus goal season, especially considering he put up 16 in 48 games with the team last year. And then we'd also like to see a fully healthy season from Burakovsky, who was the guy that everyone probably expected to be the leading goal scorer for the team going into last season. In that respect, I think another 40-goal season or more than 40 goals might be a lot to expect from McCann. He's obviously proven he can do 40 goals, but that is certainly well above anything he had ever done before, and those career seasons do happen from time to time. Even with that said, though, 30 to 35 goals I think is fair to expect from McCann at this point, and who knows, he could very well get to 40 and surpass it. he's been a surprise both of the first 2 seasons he's spent in Seattle. And while we're on the subject of goal production, if you wanted a bit of a sleeper pick, I would keep your eye on Oliver Bjorkstrand this season as a guy that could have a noticeable improvement in that category this season, considering he just came off of his second worst year of his career when it comes to shooting percentage. Something that visually we definitely saw just with the eye test, with the number of scoring chances and good scoring chances that he had, especially in the first half of last season, and just could not seem to get to go. In the end, finishing with right about exactly 10% on the shooting percentage, which was easily the lowest shooting percentage of the guys that scored at least 20 goals for the Kraken last season, and among their leading forwards was only just barely ahead of Yanni Gourde at 9.9 for Gourde, so you could also potentially keep an eye on him for a bit of a bounce back just in the luck department. But for Bjorkstrand, yeah, that's a guy that I would maybe look at for more of the 25 type of goal season from him, even from that third line. All that to say, goal production is not something I'm worried about for this team, especially considering even if you just took out the 21 goals that Sprong scored last year and didn't replace them at all with anybody, this team would still have scored more goals last season than the Golden Knights did, and, well, they won the Stanley Cup. So the Kraken could still be a very good team with slightly less goal scoring than they had last year. Really, if there are some spots that I would look at as places the Kraken need to improve, or things that could be their Achilles heel if things are going to take a turn for the worse this season, it would once again be special teams where, yeah, the penalty kill does look like something the Kraken finally got figured out in the back half of last year, where it was one of the best penalty kills in the entire league from kind of mid-January all the way through the postseason. But the power play, yeah, that still looks like something the Kraken are trying to get figured out, even in this preseason. It shows bursts of getting chances, but still not necessarily converting as much as you'd like. And then also goes through periods where it looks like they might as well have just declined the penalty and stayed at 5-on-5, where they seem to be better. Hopefully that's something they can get figured out. Time will only tell. And there is also the question of goal, but that's always going to be a question for pretty much every team, unless you have someone like Vasilevsky, Hellebuck, Shesterkin, the very few handful of goaltenders that the league has that you can count on year in, year out. And even sometimes those guys have a bit of down years like, well, kind of Hellebuck last season. Still, Grubauer is coming off of his strongest stretch of games in the postseason for the Kraken at the end of last year, so we'll go into the season thinking optimistically that he can continue to build off of that and hopefully stay in net for a consistent long period of time, where both of these first 2 seasons for him have been interrupted with injuries that definitely didn't help him get into a groove early on in either campaign. And if things don't go well in that department, well, if nothing else, Decord is always fun to watch. Plus, I do think he's probably the goaltender of the future for this team, at least as things stand right now. You never know what could happen in, say, free agency or via trade at some point, especially if a Hellebuck, for example, was no longer happy in Winnipeg. All in all, though, it should be a fun season, and I'm definitely excited to get things started here with the Kraken in this 23-24 year that hopefully leads to their second playoff run. And as far as that whole wild card thing is concerned, even if, say, the Flames were to jump the Kraken and the Kraken end up 5th in the division, the Central is not particularly strong, and this could very well be a year where 5 teams come out of the Pacific into the postseason. Again, we'll have to see whether or not that happens. And finally, before we move on entirely with the next Kraken-focused video that we'll have on this channel being the first R&R of the season on Wednesday after Tuesday night's game against Vegas, there's not only things new with the team, but also some new stuff here on the channel, the biggest of which being that we got a Patreon set up over the summer. So if you feel like you can help out the channel a little bit more, or want to help out the channel a little bit more financially, there is that option to do. I'll leave it as a link in the description down below to that Patreon, where there are some pretty cool things as far as R&Rs are especially concerned this season for the Kraken specific fans, including things like having a say in who wins the 3 stars in each R&R after each Kraken game, who wins the end of the season awards once the whole season is said and done, which, yeah, it's still a long ways away, but if you want a chance to vote on those Kraken awards at the end of the season, that's something that'll be available there. Lots of other things, voting on which videos are next, like the 101s, for example, if you're more that speed as far as the ones I have on this channel. Plenty of other stuff available too, some things a live stream, and more to come. I still haven't flushed it out necessarily all the way, but there's plenty there, especially for those of you that are fans of the R&R to get involved with. Otherwise, I'll be talking about those in the R&Rs as well, and until that first R&R, or a couple of videos that I'm hoping to get out before that first R&R, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. I'd love to know your comments down in the comment section below as to how you're feeling going into this season, how you feel about the roster, the way it's set up. I know a lot of you will be excited about Cartier being a part of the starting lineup. If you liked or enjoyed this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below as well that do help support the channel without any monetary involvement. And until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken!